Section 1 of Thoughts on Art and Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Davis Beale. Thoughts on Art and Life by Leonardo da Vinci. Translated by Maurice Baring and edited by Lewis Einstein. Thoughts on Life. Part 1. Of the Works of Leonardo. Begun at Florence, in the house of Piero di Braccio Martelli, on the 22nd day of March, 1508. And this is to be a collection without order, taken from many papers which I have copied here, hoping to arrange them later, each in its place, according to the various subjects treated. And I think that before I shall have finished this work, it will be necessary for me to repeat the same thing many times over. So, O reader, blame me not, because the subjects are many, and memory cannot retain them and say, "This I will not write because I have already written it." And if I did not wish to fall into this error, it would be necessary, every time that I wish to copy something, in order not to repeat myself, to read over all the preceding matter, all the more so since the intervals are long between one time of writing and another. His thirst after knowledge. Not louder does the tempestuous sea bellow when the north wind strikes its foaming waves between Scylla and Charybdis, nor Stromboli nor Mount Etna when the sulphurous flames, shattering and bursting open the great mountain with violence, hurl stones and earth through the air with the flame it vomits, nor when the fiery caverns of Mount Etna, spitting forth the element which it cannot restrain, hurl it back to the place whence it issued, driving furiously before any obstacle in the way of its vehement fury. So I, urged by my great desire and longing to see the blending of strange and various shapes made by creating nature, wandered for some time among the dark rocks, and came to the entrance of a great cave, in front of which I long stood in astonishment and ignorance of such a thing. I bent my back into an arch and rested my left hand on my knee, and with my right hand shaded my downcast eyes and contracted eyebrows. I bent down first on one side and then on the other to see whether I could perceive anything, but the thick darkness rendered this impossible. And, after having remained there some time, two things arose within me, fear and desire. Fear of the dark and threatening cave, desire to see whether there were anything marvelous within. I'd discover for man the origin of the first and perhaps of the second cause of his being. Leonardo's studies. Recognizing, as I do, that I cannot make use of subject matter which is useful and delightful, since my predecessors have exhausted the useful and necessary themes, I shall do as the man who by reason of his poverty arrives last at the fair, and cannot do otherwise than purchase what has already been seen by others and not accepted, but rejected by them as being of little value. I shall place this despised and rejected merchandise, which remains over after many have bought, on my poor pack, and I shall go and distribute it, not in the big cities, but in the poor towns, and take such reward as my goods deserve. Vain knowledge. All knowledge which ends in words will die as quickly as it came to life, with the exception of the written word, which is its mechanical part. Avoid studies, the result of which will die together with him who studied. Value of knowledge. The intellect will always profit by the acquisition of any knowledge whatsoever, for thus what is useless will be expelled from it, and what is fruitful will remain. It is impossible either to hate or to love a thing without first acquiring knowledge of it. Men of worth naturally desire knowledge. It is ordained that to the ambitious, who derive no satisfaction from the gifts of life and the beauty of the world, life shall be a cause of suffering, and they shall possess neither the profit nor the beauty of the world. On his contemners. I know that many will say that this work is useless, and these are they of whom Demetrius said recked no more of the breath which made the words proceed from their mouth than of the wind which proceeded from their body. Men who seek solely after riches and bodily satisfaction, men entirely denuded of that wisdom which is the food and verily the wealth of the soul, because insomuch as the soul is of greater value than the body, so much greater are the riches of the soul than those of the body. And often when I see one of these take his work in his hand, I wonder whether, like a monkey, he will not smell it and ask me if it is something to eat. On the vulgar. Demetrius used to say that there was no difference between the words and the voice of the unskilled ignorant, and the sounds and noises of a stomach full of superfluous wind. And it was not without reason that he said this, for he considered it to be indifferent whence the utterance of such men proceeded, whether from their mouth or their body, both being of the same substance and value. I do not consider that men of coarse and boorish habits and of slender parts deserve so fine an instrument, nor such a complicated mechanism as men of contemplation and high culture. They merely need a sack in which their food may be held and whence it may issue, since verily they cannot be considered otherwise than as vehicles for food, for they seem to me to have nothing in common with the human race save the shape and the voice. As far as the rest is concerned, they are lower than the beasts. Knowledge of the past and of the places of the earth is the ornament and food of the mind of man. Knowledge, the supreme good. Cornelius Celsus. Knowledge is the supreme good, the supreme evil is physical pain. We are composed of two separate parts, the soul and the body. The soul is the greater of these two, the body the lesser. Knowledge appertains to the greater part, the supreme evil belongs to the lesser and baser part. Knowledge is an excellent thing for the mind, and pain is the most grievous thing for the body. Just as the supreme evil is physical pain, so is wisdom the supreme good of the soul. That is to say, of the wise man, and no other thing can be compared with it. Life and wisdom. In the days of thy youth seek to obtain that which shall compensate the losses of thy age, and if thou understandest that old age is fed with wisdom, so conduct thyself in the days of thy youth, that sustenance may not be lacking to thy old age. Praise of knowledge. The fame of the rich man dies with him, the fame of the treasure, and not of the man who possessed it, remains. Far greater is the glory of the virtue of mortals than that of their riches. How many emperors and how many princes have lived and died, and no record of them remains, and they only sought to gain dominions and riches in order that their fame might be everlasting. How many of those who lived in scarcity of worldly goods in order to grow rich in virtue, and as far as virtue exceeds wealth, even in the same degree the desire of the poor man proved more fruitful than that of the rich man. Dost thou not see that wealth in itself confers no honor on him who amasses it, which shall last when he is dead, as does knowledge? knowledge which shall always bear witness like a clarion to its creator, since knowledge is the daughter of its creator, and not the stepdaughter like wealth. The world. Bountiful nature has provided that in all parts of the world you will find something to imitate. The beauty of life. Consider in the streets at nightfall the faces of men and women when it is bad weather, what grace and sweetness they manifest. Just as iron which is not used grows rusty, and water putrefies and freezes in the cold, so the mind, of which no use is made, is spoilt. Fruitless study. Just as food eaten without appetite is a tedious nourishment, so does study without zeal damage the memory by not assimilating what it absorbs. Truth was the only daughter of time. In praise of truth. So vile a thing is a lie, that even if it spoke fairly of God, it would take away somewhat from his divinity. So excellent a thing is truth, that if it praises the humblest things, they are exalted. There is no doubt that truth is to falsehood as light is to darkness, and so excellent a thing is truth that even when it touches humble and lowly matters, it still incomparably exceeds the uncertainty and falsehood in which great and elevated discourses are clothed. Because, even if falsehood be the fifth element of our minds, notwithstanding this, truth is the supreme nourishment of the higher intellects, though not of disorderly minds. But thou who feedest on dreams dost prefer the sophistry and subterfuges in matters of importance and uncertainty to what is certain and natural, though of lesser magnitude. Obstacles in the way of truth are finally punished. Versus humanists. I am well aware that, not being a literary man, the presumptuous will think that they have the right to blame me on the ground that I am not a man of letters. Vainglorious people! They know not that I could make answer as Marius did to the Roman people, and say, they who make a display with the labours of others will not allow me mine? They will say that, being unskilled in letters, I cannot find true expression for the matters of which I desire to treat. They do not know that in my subjects experience is a truer guide than the words of others. For experience was the teacher of all great writers, and therefore I take her for guide, and I will cite her in all cases. Although I may not be able to quote other authors as they do, I can quote from a greater and more worthy source, namely, experience, the teacher of their masters. They go about swelled with pride and pomposity, dressed up and bedight, not with their own labour, but with that of others, and they will not concede me mine. And if they despise me, who am a creator, far more are they, who do not create but trumpet abroad and exploit the works of other men, to be blamed. Authority. He who in reasoning cites authority is making use of his memory rather than of his intellect. On commentators. Men who are creators and interpreters of nature to man, in comparison with boasters and exploiters of the works of others, must be judged and esteemed like the object before the mirror as compared with its image reflected in the mirror, one being something in itself, and the other nothing. Little to nature do they owe, since it is merely by chance they wear the human form, and but for it I might include them with herds of cattle. A well-lettered man is so because he is well-natured, And just as the cause is more admirable than the effect, so is a good disposition, unlettered, more praiseworthy than a well-lettered man who is without natural disposition. Against certain commentators who disparage the inventors of antiquity, the originators of science and grammar, and who attack the creators of antiquity, and because they, through laziness and the convenience of books, have not been able to create, they attack their masters with false reasoning. It is better to imitate ancient than modern work. Experience. Wisdom is the daughter of experience. Experience never errs. Wrongly men complain of experience, which with great railing they accuse of falsehood. Leave experience alone, and turn your lamentation to your ignorance, which leads you, with your vain and foolish desires, to promise yourselves those things which are not in her power to confer, and to accuse her of falsehood. Wrongly men complain of innocent experience, when they accuse her not seldom of false and lying demonstrations. Experience never errs. It is only your judgments that err, ye who look to her for effects which our experiments cannot produce. Because given a principle, that which ensues from it is necessarily the true consequence of that principle, unless it be impeded. Should there, however, be any obstacle, the effort which should ensue from the aforesaid principle will participate in the impediment as much or as little as the impediment is operative in regard to the aforesaid principle. Experience, the interpreter between creative nature and the human race, teaches the action of nature among mortals. How, under the constraint of necessity, she cannot act otherwise than as reason, who steers her helm, teaches her to act. All our knowledge is the offspring of our perceptions. Origin of knowledge. The sense ministers to the soul, and not the soul sense. And where the sense which ministers ceases to serve the soul, all the functions of that sense are lacking in life, as is evident in those who are born dumb and blind. Testimony of the senses. And if thou sayest that sight impedes the security and subtlety of mental meditation, by reason of which we penetrate into divine knowledge, and that this impediment drove a philosopher to deprive himself of his sight, I answered that the eye, as the lord of the senses, performs its duty in being an impediment to the confusion and lies of that which is not science but discourse, and by which, with much noise and gesticulation, argument is constantly conducted. And hearing should do the same, feeling, as it does, the offence more keenly, because it seeks after harmony, which devolves on all the senses. And if this philosopher deprived himself of his sight to get rid of the obstacle to his discourses, consider that his discourses and his brain were a party to the act, because the whole was madness. Now, could he not have closed his eyes when this frenzy came upon him, and have kept them closed until the frenzy consumed itself? But the man was mad, the discourse insane, and egregious the folly of destroying his eyesight. Judgment prone to error. There is nothing which deceives us as much as our own judgment. The greatest deception which men incur proceeds from their opinions. Avoid the precepts of those thinkers whose reasoning is not confirmed by experience. Intelligence of animals. Man discourseth greatly, and his discourse is for the greater part empty and false. The discourse of animals is small, but useful and true. Slender certainty is better than portentous falsehood. What is an element? It is not in man's power to define the quiddity of the elements, but a great many of their effects are known. That which is divisible in fact is divisible in potentiality also, but not all quantities which are divisible in potentiality are divisible in fact. End of section 1.